Ben Shapiro enrolled at UCLA at the age of 16, where he graduated summa cum laude and Phi Beta Kappa. That was followed by Harvard Law School. He's been a nationally syndicated columnist since the age of 17. I guess he's on what some would call today an accelerated career path. He's editor-in-chief of DailyWire.com, as well as editor-at-large of Breitbart News. He's a frequent guest on radio and television, and he hosts his own radio show, which I guess he's maybe playing hooky from this morning, called The Morning Answer, which airs here in the Los Angeles area. He's the author of numerous books, including Brainwashed: How Universities Indoctrinate America's Youth. He wrote that at the ripe old age of 20. What do you want to be when you grow up, Ben? Other books include Primetime Propaganda: The True Story of How the Hollywood Left Took Over Your Television, and Bullies: How the Left's Culture of Fear and Intimidation Silences America. He's a leading voice in opposition to the movement to boycott, divest from, and sanction Israel that is taking place on so many of America's campuses today, but I hasten to add, not on Hillsdale's. And he will be speaking this morning on the topic, Politics on the American Campus. Please welcome Ben Shapiro.
Thanks so much. Well, it's a pleasure to be talking to people who have experience with campus that doesn't involve protesters and screaming children and all the other fun things that we tend to associate with the American left these days. So other than Hillsdale, America's college campuses have become a breeding ground for failure, career failure and moral failure and emotional failure. There's a reason that when you go to hire college students these days, what you tend to get is a group of entitled brats who think they should get six-figure salaries for having majored in lesbian dance theory. This is all thanks to a perverse leftist ideology that rewards subjective self-aggrandizement over objective truth. So let's start with a story. This is from Tennessee, Vanderbilt University. I'm sure some people in the audience know where Vandy is. This is back in November, last November. So you remember last year there was this whole media obsession that every college campuses all over America were rife with racism. They were just hotbeds of secret racism. The KKK had branches that were secretly meeting at frat houses. All the black people on campus were being targeted for destruction. The administrators clearly hated black folks, which is why they let them in with lower SAT scores. And so there are all sorts of protesters who showed up at campuses all over America. So 200 students at Vandy decided that they wanted to protest the white privilege and microaggressions of the administration. We'll define those terms in just a few minutes. They didn't give any particular examples of what the discrimination looked like, but it didn't matter if there was any actual fact to back what they were saying. They felt victimized, and that's the key. They felt victimized. So they demanded university diversity classes and a more diverse student body, not ideologically diverse, of course, ethnically, racially diverse. The next day, after they had this big protest, a big bag of dog poop showed up at the front door of the Bishop Joseph Johnson Black Cultural Center. And naturally, the apocalypse ensued. The student activist group that sponsored the original march rushed to Facebook to denounce what they called the vile act, and they said, quote, "The violation of a place that in many ways is the sole home for many black students is deplorable. As many of us sit in grief, recognize that these types of actions are what we speak of when we note the reality of exclusion and isolation of students of color, and specifically black students on our campus." So the police investigated, and nobody was arrested or prosecuted. Clear evidence of white racism, right? Well, not so much. It turns out that the bag of dog poo was not a racist attack. In fact, it was left with by a blind girl with a service dog. She couldn't find a trash can, so she followed what is apparently normal procedure, which is if you can't find a trash can, what you do is you leave the bag of dog poop outside the nearest inhabited building, knowing that somebody will come out in the morning, pick it up, and throw it in the garbage. So you'd imagine that this student group would have a little bit of dog poop on its face, right? I mean, this is a little bit embarrassing. Well, not so much. They apologized, but then they added, quote, "The needs of students with disabilities on this campus are also marginalized." So the blind girl who left the dog poop, who they originally thought was some racist KKK member who'd abandoned the cross-burning routine and instead decided to drop dog excrement in front of black buildings, turned out to be a blind girl, and they now say that the blind girl is a victim of campus exclusion. So this is how it goes at America's college campuses. There's a phrase that you hear very often on college campus these days: check your privilege. You hear this one a lot: check your privilege. And what this really means is that you're not part of one of the victimized groups, the so-called hierarchy of victims that has been created at college campuses. America's college campuses have one overriding goal. It's the same goal as that of the American and international left, and that is to level all inequality of outcome. Inequality of outcome equals inequity. If somebody in a room has $4 and somebody has $1, it can't be the person with $4 worked hard and the person with $1 blew their money. It has to be the person with $4 somehow owes at least a couple of dollars to the person with $1. Everybody should end up with $2.50 in this magical world. America's founding fathers obviously didn't believe in this. They believed in equality of opportunity. They thought rightly that God or nature provided mankind with rights to life, liberty, and happiness. These are rights against the collective. They're rights against the society. The international left, the American left, the campus left, they believe that true opportunity can really only be reflected in result. Any inequality has to be the result of inequity. It's true for individuals, it's true for groups, and we can't just measure inequality in economic terms. It's not just the $4, $1 thing. We have to feel equal. We have to feel it. Deep in our bones, we have to feel like we're not being discriminated against, like society isn't colluding to harm us. So on college campuses, the administrators who buy into this stupid philosophy, they've set up their own little mini utopias. And that means grade inflation, so everybody gets an A, right? Because we don't want to have anybody who feels like they are going to get a C. That means that they've been discriminated against even if they can't write a complete sentence. Government-sponsored tuition ensures that everyone has an equal shot to go to college, regardless of whether going to college is actually the best thing for all these kids. This is the Bernie Sanders utopian vision. Everybody should have a government-sponsored slot in college. You know, that idea is basically what ruined American high schools and now is ruining American colleges. Because it turns out the kids didn't learn anything in junior high. We pushed them up to high school, said everyone should have an equal high school education. Everybody didn't learn anything in high school. Now they're pushing them up to colleges. They're watering it down. So basically, the only way you get a really good job is if you go to grad school. Right? And sooner or later, we will just be in school from the time we are born until the time we die. There will be a 2-day period at the very end where you're expected to earn, and then you will die. So college administrators are working to ensure that every individual on campus feels equally valuable. This is their goal. And that's not really enough because reality doesn't match the vision, right? There are always going to be individuals who underperform or groups that underperform. This happens throughout human society. It's happened throughout human history. There is no society across planet Earth, as Thomas Sowell writes in his newest book, in which there is no inequality. It just doesn't exist. There's always been group and individual inequality. It always will exist because people are differently abled. People have different abilities, people have different skills, people have different effort levels. But because the facts don't match the vision, the left instead blames the structure of the United States, right? It's structural inequality that's the problem. Our history, our values, our economics, this is the real problem. It must have failed because of the racist, classist, sexist, homophobic system, both on campus and off. And so the system has to be torn out root and branch. And what the administrators do is they make students their allies in this effort. Which is easy, because there's something that feels good about being a victim. It gives you an unearned sense of virtue that you get to parade around. You feel like a better person if you're a victim. If you're an underachieving black woman, then the campus culture will tell you that the reason you're underachieving is not because of anything you did, it's because you're black and because you're a woman. And that's because society discriminates against black people and women. If you're an underachieving gay Hispanic, then that's because the system targets people like you. For everybody who's left, and this is basically just what they call white heterosexual cisgender males. Cisgender, for those who speak English, cisgender means that you have an orientation toward your own gender that is the same as your biology. In other words, I'm a biological male and I think I'm a biological male. Right? That's what cisgender means. Seriously, I mean, we laugh, but this is actually a thing. On campus, cisgender has become a thing now, right? Because we can't discriminate against people who are biologically male but we can't discriminate against Caitlyn Jenner, so everybody else has to abide by these silly linguistic conventions. But for people who are left, the white heterosexual cisgender males, there is one way that they can get out of the unenviable position of being the only people in America who are not victims, right, according to the left. And that is, they have to acknowledge their privilege. They have to check their privilege. Because the system was built to benefit all of the white heterosexual cisgender males, right? Forget the fact that there are more white people on welfare than black people on welfare. Forget the fact that there are plenty of poor white people all over the United States. Forget the fact that in college admissions, for example, white men are disadvantaged by affirmative action programs. Not quite as much as Asians, by the way, but they are very disadvantaged by all of these programs. So you have to acknowledge your white privilege, which means America is bad and you're bad. And by saying that you're bad, that makes you good, right? You acknowledge your guilt, mea culpa, mea maxima culpa, and now everything is good. So none of this complies with the facts, and this is the problem, because when this white privilege faces up to reality on campus, they have to come up with something else. And what they have to come up with is the use of force, right? They have to come up with the use of force. So to digress for a moment, here's a brief history, and this goes by the title political correctness, right? Political correctness is basically the campus use of force in order to shut down the debate, to create this own vision of utopia where everybody is forced to shut up. Because if you ever utter the unalterable truth that some people perform less well than others in a free society, then you must be silenced. So here's a brief history of political correctness on campus, because campuses weren't always this way. But the remolding of America's college campuses has been a very long intergenerational process, encompassing virtually the whole of the 20th century. And by the way, not unique to the United States. Sowell writes, quote, "The history of the 20th century shows soft subject students and their professors were among the biggest supporters of extremist movements, both fascist and communist, the former in Central and Eastern Europe before World War II, the latter in countries around the world both before and after the war. Proponents of soft subject education, this would be liberal arts educations, always have a generalized interest in radical ideas, because this is what you get famous for. This is how you get a fortune. Right? You don't become famous or gain a fortune by talking about the glories of Western civilization. You do it by ripping on Western civilization. The outlier is always the person who gets the attention. And young people, of course, are happy to ally with this, because young people always have a taste for revolution, particularly in prosperous societies. In prosperous societies, young people have nothing better to do, and they have a need to change the world. And if the world's already a pretty good place, then they still have to change it, and so they change it in a negative way. Well, in the 60s, all of this sort of combined to push over all the weak-kneed administrators at American universities, and college campuses then became bubbles of leftist thought. And they used as their tool political correctness. Now, when people say politically correct, it's become such a buzzword that we forgot where it actually came from. The term political correctness is a Maoist term, right? Mao used the term political correctness. Trotsky used to use this term also. What it meant literally was that what you were saying was not in line with the correct political orthodoxy, and therefore you had to be harmed, right? That's what political correctness meant. The left picked it up. They said that their goal wasn't to silence voices. Instead, they wanted to open up new vistas of viewpoints by silencing people. Free speech, they said, could only exist in a place where there was no racism, no sexism, no homophobia, nothing offensive. Then people would really feel free to speak their minds. Right, this is the idea. So basic viewpoints, basic truths went out the window in favor of leftist viewpoints. Victim groups replaced actual truth. And language shifted so that we didn't create these quote-unquote oppressive hierarchies that silenced people who would normally have been able to speak out if not for the evil white infrastructure. After the 60s and 70s, basically PC became a joke for about 20 years, and then, well, really 30, and then President Obama came along. And President Obama really ushered in a new era of political correctness on college campuses and across the United States, because he promised a world of non-offensiveness, a world in which liberty could be defined subjectively as full-scale offenses. Political correctness says you don't even have to be a member of a victimized subgroup. You don't even have to be victimized in order to call political correctness and shut down the debate. You need to feel victimized. It's all about how you feel. So what this does is it incentivizes everybody to become a victim in their own mind, right? Because you have an advantage now. The minute that you claim that you're a victim, you can now shut everybody else up. Right? Anybody who talks to you, I'm a victim, you hurt my feelings, shut up and go away. This is what we call fascism, right? But it's a fascism of cowardice. And on college campuses, I've called them the panty waist fascists. They've fully embraced this new form of political correctness. And there are a couple of hot button terms that they use: microaggressions, trigger warnings, safe spaces, and white privilege. I'm sure you've heard all of these on the news: microaggressions, trigger warnings, safe spaces, and white privilege. So what are microaggressions? You hear this one all the time. Even the left makes fun of this, even while it still pushes it. Microaggressions are basically, we'll use the definition given by Jonathan Haidt, who's a psychologist over at NYU. He says microaggressions are, quote, small actions or word choices that seem on their face to have no malicious intent, but that are thought of as a kind of violence nonetheless. Right? So they're not offensive. You're not saying anything offensive, but I take it as offensive. That is a microaggression. So, for example, if you say, I'm colorblind, you're in the middle of a conversation about race, and you say, I'm colorblind, that is a microaggression, because it implies something that isn't true, which is that you're colorblind. Right? And that's aggressive to somebody. That makes me feel bad, because if you're colorblind, you expect me to perform in a meritorious fashion, and that in and of itself is a racist notion. I'm totally serious here. This is not even a joke. Okay, if you use terms like he and she, this is a microaggression because it offends the non-cisgender. Right? If you ask, where are you from? These are on lists of websites. You can find these in college guides now. Where are you from is a microaggression because it implies that you're not a native-born person. All about the subjective, right? It's how offended am I subjectively, not whether this statement is objectively offensive. And of course, nobody bothers to ask whether such microaggressions are freedom of speech. They have to be quashed. So last year at University of Missouri, for example, I spoke at University of Missouri shortly after they had this big blow-up there, and one of the things that they announced basically in advance is that if people were using hurtful words, people should call the police. Seriously. That, of course, is totalitarianism. That's using the power of the gun to shut people up. Right? You're literally calling men with guns because your feelings were hurt. That is totalitarianism in its finest form. And it reaches even more ridiculous proportions. So, for example, at Brandeis University, which is just an uber-left campus in Boston, if you even discuss microaggressions, it's a microaggression. So, I mean, it's beyond parody. You actually cannot make these things up. So last year, the Brandeis Asian American Student Association put out what they called an installation in the public square to, quote, bring attention to microaggressions that are frequently heard in and out of the Brandeis community, according to their Facebook page. So they put up a wall, and then they put up all these phrases, like where are you from, and are you a he, or using the word he. They put all these on a wall to raise people's awareness that these things were microaggressions. Sure enough, some Asian American students felt microaggressed by the display itself, so it was removed. Now, to prevent people from being microaggressed, one of the other phrases that's come into common usage is the phrase trigger warning. You've heard this one too. Right? And trigger warnings are the idea that before we say anything, we have to give you a trigger warning. So if I'm going to talk about rape on college campus, I have to say, trigger warning, I'm about to talk about rape. If you have been raped in the past, know anybody who's been raped in the past, read about anybody who's been raped in the past, or know the definition of the word rape, I do not mean to offend you. Right? That's a trigger warning. So colleges have now required that certain classic works of literature actually be accompanied by trigger warnings so that people aren't triggered. So the idea here being that somebody's going to have like a Vietnam flashback while reading East of Eden. Again, the point here is that nothing subjectively offensive must occur under this regime of political correctness. Right? Perception is the reality. So once the microaggressions have been put aside, and once trigger warnings have been issued, then campuses are what are known as safe spaces. Right? So the implication here is clear, that if you are subjected to language with which you disagree, then you are now in an unsafe space. You require the protection of men with guns. You require segregated areas. In fact, at University of Missouri, you had a bunch of black students who were protesting supposed systemic racism at University of Missouri, which has an affirmative action program and no objective evidence of racism on behalf of the administration. While they were protesting, it turns out that there were some mewling white students who wanted to join them as well, some of these black students. The black students said, we don't want you here because you aren't part of our microaggressed population, right? You haven't been aggressed in the same way that we have. We want a segregated space in which to protest, right? Only black people, which is, and at USC, right, just down the couple hours out of here, the black students have been applying for separate black housing. They actually want separate black housing because they think that it's a microaggression, or that they require their own black safe space, right? Which is something that the KKK would love, right? It's both separate and equal. It's awesome. All of this is actually making America's young people not only stupid, but actually evil. It's actually making America's young people evil. Because what this does is it creates an entire generation of mentally and emotionally stunted human beings who are completely unprepared for the real world, where you're going to have to face up to people who disagree and realities that show that your vision is wrong, and you're going to have to deal with people on the other side of the aisle. Right? Jonathan Haidt, that psychologist, he wrote, quote, "The recent collegiate trend of uncovering allegedly racist, sexist, classist, or otherwise discriminatory microaggressions doesn't incidentally teach students to focus on small or accidental slights. Its purpose is to get students to focus on them and then relabel the people who have made such remarks as aggressors." Right? So the idea is you're supposed to constantly be policing the world around you for microaggressions. You're supposed to be looking to be offended. You get credit for being offended. You're a hero for being offended. Now, for anybody who's ever had experience with psychologists, I live in LA. That means 100% of people have had experience with psychologists. But for anybody who has ever had experience with psychologists, you know that there's something called cognitive behavioral therapy. Right? This is the most common form of psychology that's now used, cognitive behavioral therapy. This is where you're having a chain of thoughts that leads you to be depressed or anxious or upset. And what the psychologist will do is attempt to teach you how to break this bad chain of thoughts. So if you're microaggressed by something, the psychologist says, well, why don't you think it through? Is it possible that the person actually didn't mean to offend you? Right? And you're just going down this road too far, and you're getting upset, you're getting depressed, you're getting anxious over all of this. Cognitive behavioral therapy is, in fact, one of the only forms of psychology that is clinically proven to work. Colleges are now doing precisely the opposite. So if you say to kids, you're not being microaggressed, you're just being too sensitive, right? Nobody means to offend you. You're just oversensitive. Now you're microaggressing times 2. Now you're really ruining their lives. And so what you've created is this subjective, this world in which kids are rewarded for their own subjective victimization, looking to be offended all the time. It also makes kids, I said earlier, it makes kids evil. It does. There's a professor named Roy Baumeister, he's another psychologist, and he writes, there's a book called Evil, Inside Human Violence and Cruelty. He says, evil behavior generally springs from idealism that turns to violence, unjustified self-esteem, and hypersensitivity. These are 3 of the elements of evil. So we tend to think of evil people as like James Bond villains who sit in rooms and they have shark tanks underneath their giant conference tables and they laugh at the suffering of others. And that's not really what most evil people are. Baumeister says people who think they're better than they are will be the dangerous ones. Hypersensitive people who often think their pride is being assaulted are potentially dangerous. Even when a neutral observer would conclude that no serious provocation occurred, it is still important to recognize that, in the perpetrator's own view, he or she was merely responding to an attack. Going back to the word microaggressions, just think about that for a second. It's not an offensive statement. They could just call it an offensive statement. It's a microaggression. It's an aggression against you. And in normal life, if somebody aggresses against you, if somebody punches you, you punch them back, right? So now the rule is that if you say something that microaggresses somebody, they can basically punch you. And this is actually not just become a thing on campus, this has become a thing all across the American left now. Quick personal aside, I was on CNN, this would have been about 6 months ago, and I was on CNN to discuss Caitlyn Jenner being given the Heroism Award by ESPN, because our definition of heroism has shifted a little bit since Normandy. And while I was on CNN, they put me on the Dr. Drew show, which is watched by no one, and he's a terrible host. So that aside, so they asked me to be on the Dr. Drew show to talk about Caitlyn Jenner's heroism, and because the producer is a former Jerry Springer producer, seriously, he knows my perspective on transgenderism, which is that transgenderism is a mental illness. Okay, you can't magically change from a man into a woman. The transgender surgery has exactly the same suicide rate after as before. Transgender people try to commit suicide at a 40% rate because there's comorbidity between transgenderism and depression. And so, you know, I went in, I told them all this stuff beforehand. When you're on national TV, they always do a pre-interview so they know sort of what you're going to say. Well, right before the show, they say, okay, we're going to sit you next to this person named Zoe Tur. Zoe Tur was formerly Bob Tur. So Zoe Tur is a transgender woman. He's a man who thinks that he's a woman and had the surgery to prove it. His voice was about an octave lower than mine, and he had about 20 pounds on me at least, which becomes relevant actually to this story. So we're going through this entire rigmarole about transgenderism. Is Caitlyn Jenner a hero? And the argument of everybody on the panel is about 5 people on the panel plus Dr. Drew. The argument was from everybody was, is Caitlyn Jenner a hero, or should Caitlyn Jenner be actually canonized as a saint? That was the argument on CNN. And so they came back to me, and I said, I don't understand why we're humoring delusion. Right? Why is society humoring delusion? You're not doing anybody any good. You're not doing any good for transgender people. You're not doing any good for confused young people. You're not doing any good for children who have to know about gender roles. Right? You're not doing anybody any good. And Bob Tur, Zoe Tur, is sitting next to me and turns to me and says, you don't know anything about biology. And I said, well, actually, I know that every cell in your body is genetically male except for some of your sperm cells, ironically, which may just carry an X chromosome, right? And he says, you know, well, you don't understand anything about chromosomes. And I said, well, what are your genetics, sir? Right? And I didn't mean it to be particularly offensive, because he's a dude, and I call dude sir. And so it was the sir that sort of set him off, apparently. He on national television, he reaches over, and we're sitting, 2 feet from me, not even, maybe a foot and a half from each other. He reaches over and grabs me by the back of the neck on national television and says, "If you say anything like that again, I'll send you home in an ambulance." Which, first of all, doesn't make sense because ambulances don't take you home. But and I said, this seems my actual reply. I was really taken aback. Like, this has never happened to me on national TV before because it's a crime, right? And so, like, it's an actual battery. I'm a lawyer, I know. And so I said, I was kind of taken aback, and I said, this seems mildly inappropriate for a political conversation. And what was amazing about it, though, what was truly incredible about it, was not that this incident happened. It was that the entire panel, all of them, universally, say, again, there are 5 more people on the panel, universally turn on me and say, "How dare you offend Zoe? You were deliberately offensive to Zoe. That's why Zoe did that. This is your fault." In other words, it was a microaggression, and it could be responded to in kind with actual aggression. Right? It didn't end there, by the way. As Zoe Tur walks off the set, he says to me, "I'll see you in the parking lot," and then later tweeted that he wanted to curb stomp me. Right? And all of this is okay. Dr. Drew later said he thought that everything was totally under control. Dr. Drew did. So this is the way that the left thinks, and it starts on campuses. So all of this kind of silly, laugh-out-loud, ridiculous nonsense about microaggressions, this is how the left moves toward actual fascism. There is a reason that a November 2015 Pew poll showed that 40% of millennials, people my age, like 18 to 33, right, people 18 to 34, 40% of them believe that the government should be able to prevent people from making, quote, statements that are offensive to minority groups. 40%, 4 in 10 people my age or younger think, 4 in 10, think the government should be able to come into your house with a gun and stop you from making statements that someone feels are offensive. Okay, talk about the end of free speech, talk about the end of the country. That's the end of the country in real time, and it's happening on college campuses. And this is happening all over the United States. I spoke at a high school outside of San Diego called Otay Ranch High School. And I was talking to the students, and one of the things I said to the students is that people who are permanently poor in the United States are permanently poor as a general matter because they're not good with money. Right? If you're temporarily poor, that could be because you came upon hard times, you had a health problem, it could be because you weren't able to hold down a job, it could be a variety of reasons.